Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today for day 2 of the Spring 2023 HBCU and MSI Science Policy College Tour. If you are returning from yesterday, we are glad to have you back. And if today will be your first set of sessions, welcome. I'm Kimberly Grimes, Membership Associate with NSPN. I am so excited to be hosting this awesome event where a wealth of knowledge and experience will be shared by science policy professionals over the next 2 days for those new to science policy or for those hoping to expand their understanding and delve deeper. Following each session, we will have a Q&A segment with the speakers. Feel free to add your questions to the chat as they come to you during the presentation, or you can send me a private message with your question if you feel more comfortable. In the event we do not get to every question, if they are in the chat, we can get them answered and provided to you after the tour. There will be breaks between each presentation to allow you to get up, stretch your legs, and to also view updates, information about science policy opportunities, answer some trivia, and a QR code will be provided on screen if you decide you want to register for an upcoming session. You can scan this code to register and get details about upcoming speakers' presentations. As we get started, if you are comfortable, feel free to type your school and/or where you are located in the chat. Today's guest is Dr. Paige Greenwood, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, whose research is funded by a T32 grant for translational research in child psychiatric disorders. Her research focuses on the compounding effects of prenatal exposure to air pollution and proximal measures of socioeconomic disadvantage on the brain and academic outcomes in childhood using functional MRI techniques. In addition to research, Dr. Greenwood was also a 2022 Early Career Policy Ambassador for the Society for Neuroscience. In this role, she aimed to highlight environmental health and neuroscience research for local and state legislators. Paige hopes to integrate her research and policy experiences to develop targeted interventions that improve academic outcomes and to advocate for the implementation of policy that supports health and educational equity for disadvantaged children. She became a co-founder for Black in Neuro in 2020 and is currently the professional development co-chair, organizing events to support and train developing neuroscientists. Prior to her PhD, Dr. Greenwood received her BS in biology at Hampton University and was a T34 Mark Award recipient, which provided advanced biomedical research training. She received her PhD in neuroscience from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine in 2021, where her dissertation work investigated the role of maternal education and reading fluency on reading circuitry in childhood. Without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it off to Dr. Greenwood.
Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be here today to discuss with you some of the local and state advocacy work that I've been doing during my doctoral training as well as my postdoc. I apologize in advance if there is any crazy noises in the background. They are doing construction on my building currently, so I'll try to make sure that this is seamless as possible. And if there are any issues, please let me know so I can adjust and make sure that you guys can hear me. So I'll go ahead and get my slides up. Can you guys see that okay?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, awesome. All right, so today I'll be presenting to you all on impacting our communities with local advocacy. Just from my outline, some of the things that I'll be going over for this presentation is my background. I'll talk a little bit about my research experience and how that's kind of navigated some of the science policy topics that I've been interested in. I'll also discuss with you guys the importance of local advocacy and incorporate that state component too. Talk about the translation and dissemination of research. And then lastly, steps to engage in local advocacy within your own communities. So just to go over my background, I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, and I really started to grow my interest in science, actually in my physics teacher's class, Dr. Suari. Physics was not my favorite subject. It was probably the worst subject to me, but she made it super engaging and interesting. And she was one of the first people who really told me, hey, you could really make something of yourself in this science field. So I decided to go on and pursue my bachelor's of science in biology at Hampton University, historically Black college. In the real HU, sorry to anybody who's on the call that's from Howard. Uh, At Hampton, I became a part of the MarkU Scholars Program, which is an NIH research training program that aims to develop a diverse pool of undergraduate students who will then go on to complete higher education programs, such as getting a PhD or an MD PhD. This program really exposed me to the different options that I could take with a science degree, since primarily I was focusing my attention on going to medical school, and that was essentially all I knew. But I was able to do internships at universities like Johns Hopkins, Brandeis University, and it really started to like open the breadth of my understanding of what you could do with a science degree. So I decided to pursue my PhD in neuroscience, as I really wanted to learn more about learning disabilities in children. At the University of Cincinnati, I joined Dr. Zippy Horowitz-Cross's lab, and she studied the role of executive functions on reading abilities using functional magnetic resonance imaging techniques, or fMRI. And I became really interested in examining environmental factors and how that plays a role in child reading acquisition, child learning, brain development, specifically with a focus on minoritized participants, because those are the folks that we usually don't see being served in a research capacity. So this was really important to me. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview, the environment is a strong contributor to child development, and examining the environment's contributions holistically can help us start to understand or disentangle some of the effects or the deficits in reading ability. Specifically, this model called Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, it focuses on the child's evolving environment based on complex proximal interactions within the environment, such as interactions between neighborhood, the home environment, interactions between parent and child. All of these different things definitely play a central role in the well-being or the development of children. And for children growing up in the context of disadvantage, a lot of these kids have lower early reading skills on the onset of formal literacy instruction, a slower trajectory of literacy growth over the early school years. And a lot of that is attributed to resource allocation. It's attributed to the home environment and what's accessible in the home environment. The school and the classroom quality and the structure are all essential contributors to reading acquisition and the development of children. And one critical factor that we've examined as a neuroscientist is the home literacy environment. And what you're seeing right here is the left hemisphere of the brain. And this particular study examined whether or not maternal-child shared reading quality scores were associated with brain activation for their preschool children. And this particular study found that the better the mother was with their quality of reading scores, the more engaged brain regions were that are attributed to semantic processing and phonological processing and all of these critical skills that are needed for reading acquisition. So socioeconomic differences in the home literacy experiences have been reported, such that folks that do come from low-income environments are less likely to engage in daily literacy practices. But that might not be true, as some have reported that there is considerable variability in home literacy environments where low-income families do read to their children at least 3 times a week. Therefore, it's important to see how we're conceptualizing the home literacy environment, especially for underserved populations. And within my own research, I was interested in maternal reading fluency scores. So how fluent can the mother read words? Is it easily interpretable to the child? And so with this particular study, I examined maternal reading fluency and its association to the development of their preschool children's language network. And what we found was that the less synchronized the mother's reading fluency was, the more connectivity we saw in brain regions that were related to language and reading related abilities, suggesting this potential compensation to process the narratives if their mother is less fluent with a higher level of cognitive demand due to that lower reading fluency. Thus, I really wanted to continue doing this work to examine the contributions of maternal variables and their influences on child reading development. So within my dissertation research, like the biggest question that I had was, what's the role of maternal education on executive functions and the neurobiological correlates of reading for children that have varying reading profiles? So kids who are have reading difficulties, those are typically developing. And I began running this very large research study for my PI, where we had these different visits and intervention sessions. So the first visit would be the kids would come in, we would administer these behavioral assessments to look at IQ, reading, executive functions, and then we would scan their brains in order to look at structure and function and relate those behavioral measures to the brain measures. We also incorporated an intervention. So we would, for 8 weeks, give the child a randomized intervention assessment, and they would complete that over that 8-week period, and then come back for a second visit so that we could really see if there were any changes after the intervention. However, through my work, I started to realize we were really not capturing the diversity that we see amongst kids that have reading disabilities. And we were having a big problem with being able to retain low-income participants, showing you that there was a lack of diversity in our population. And this lack of racial and economic diversity in research is a critical problem when we think about it, because we're really not capturing the different experiences or changes that are happening amongst underserved or minoritized groups of folks. And so within my study, the population was majority white. It was easier to recruit participants that had parents within the hospital as opposed to families within the community. And I really didn't have any formalized training as a doctoral candidate to retain participants, knowing retention strategies and things like along those lines. And so I was coming in at a disadvantage. In addition, the average education level was a bachelor's degree or higher, which was also a critical problem because we weren't really capturing that diversity and the lower levels of maternal education. And why this is important is because research has shown us that kids that come from different socioeconomic backgrounds may engage their brains differently. So for example, you can see here, this was a study that was done where kids from low and high income backgrounds with similar below average reading ability were recruited for this study. And what they found was that amongst the high income children, they actually down here, they underactivated a region that was involved in visual word recognition, which is a classical signature of a dyslexic phenotype, which is a genetic type of reading disability, versus the low income kids, which did engage this visual word recognition region, showing that or suggesting that children that come from low income backgrounds may be more influenced by environmental interactions versus kids that come from higher income backgrounds. They may have more of a susceptibility for a dyslexic phenotype of reading problems. And at this stage, it was really critical for me to examine this further and to provide outreach to participants that were low income and were more underserved or minoritized. So the biggest question that I came to was, if I can't do this in my research, how do I positively impact low SES youth with reading difficulties within my community? How do I start to leverage the understanding that I've started to build with all of the research that I've been doing, all of the manuscripts I'm having to read, all of this information that I'm having to weave through? How do I apply it into a local context to support families that are underserved? So my first step was in my 4th year of graduate school. I learned about science policy through one of my friends, Dr. Kayla Miles. She was a huge mentor and actually the first Black woman at the University of Cincinnati to graduate from our neuroscience program. So she's a huge trailblazer, but also a big trailblazer with inspiring me to actually want to merge that scientific aspect with a local advocacy aspect. So I attended the NSPN, or National Science Policy Network conference, with the theme being on leveraging science and technology to benefit marginalized populations. This was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2019. And I was coming in at a huge disadvantage because I knew nothing about science policy, but attending the workshops and learning from other early career scientists about some of the work that they're applying in their community, going to the poster sessions and seeing how people are really able to catalyze sustainable change with their scientific research really inspired me to want to see how I could do some of that in my own community. How could I be involved in a positive way? So I was always thinking about, when I think about science policy, or at least at that stage, I was always thinking about it in the context of the state or federal levels of government. That is where things get done. That's who I need to talk to. Those are the people that I need to be contacting. But at this conference, through workshops and conversations with other early career scientists, I really learned that I could actually make sustainable change within my community without having to branch out too far because we have local governments. And in order to do that, I had to really, disentangle like what is the structure of the local government and why is it important? Well, we know our communities and our local government face societal changes that could be addressed with science and technology policy implementation. And it is critical that we figure out ways to use scientific evidence to change or create sustainable change within our community. For example, the pandemic really showed us, brought attention to this digital divide and the importance of providing technological resources to low-income children so they wouldn't fall behind. And so that's a issue that was happening in our local community, especially when I was living in Cincinnati, that could be addressed through advocacy and conversations with the appropriate stakeholders. And so in order to really know, the structure, I had to dig a little bit deeper into, okay, what does the city council look like? What's the mayor look like? The city manager? In order to really start to disentangle like what everybody's role is within the structure of the local government. So the mayor is like our spokesperson for the council or the city council. This is the public face in the planning process. The mayor is responsible for explaining the purpose of the community strategic plan to the community and for encouraging public participation in that process. They're the face. However, you also have your city council, and these are folks that are elected into these positions. They review and approve the annual budgets. They establish long-term and short-term goals and priorities. They oversee the performance of local public employees, effectiveness of programs, tax rates, legal contracts, borrowing funds, all of these different things that are really essential for helping our communities run smoothly, they're involved in. And they also pass ordinances and resolutions. And so I really started to hone in on my city council within Cincinnati so that I could see who were our elected officials, who were the folks that were in charge, and what were some of the things that they were focused on, what were their priorities. So going back to reading, the National Center for Education Statistics gives us data year to year on 4th grade, 8th grade reading achievement, math, science. And at that time, while I was in school in 2019, the Ohio 4th grade reading achievement was really low. So 56% of children that qualified for free or reduced lunch based on their socioeconomic status, they underperformed significantly compared to those that were not eligible. In fact, there was a 27-point difference in their reading scores, and there wasn't really any change over that time period. And when you go on the National Center for Education Statistics, if any of you all have been on that website, you can actually look at each year, like even up to the 90s, for what the trajectory of performance or achievement looks like based on your state, based on districts, based on, whether or not a person is Black, Latinx, Asian. You can look at the free or reduced lunch category, private schools, public schools, and this really starts to provide like a comprehensive overview of what achievement levels look like based on what your community is. So I wanted to do more to support these kids. So I started to figure out, okay, I need to outline a plan to support these families further and figure out how to move forward. So the first thing I did was determine my advocacy goals. The goals and objectives of advocacy are to facilitate change in the development of new areas of policy in order to tackle unmet health needs or deal with emerging health needs within a community. And so I wanted to identify that key issue that affected my community, which was reading awareness and literacy. We know literacy is important for economic prosperity. We know it's associated with high school dropouts, it's associated with lower self-esteem, and there are some associations to the prison to school pipeline. And so, this was a critical issue that needed to be addressed within our community. So we have to start identifying SMART goals. And these are some things that you guys can do within your own research or determining your own advocacy goals. And SMART is a way of reminding you that your objectives should be, one, specific. And to be specific is you need to set a specific objective for each of your advocacy goals. What are you trying to accomplish? What does it need to be done in order for you to be able to do that? In addition, is it measurable? Is your objective measurable, and how do you determine whether or not there was good efficacy with that project? The next thing, is it achievable? The research or advocacy goal that you're putting out there should be attainable and it should be practical, because you don't want to put yourself out there with something that's much, much bigger than you're able to accomplish. I know for me, for example, I tend to think in big, 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 big pictures. And with all the pieces that come into accomplishing a goal that's a bigger picture, I know that I would not have been able to attain that over the amount of time that I had allotted. So I had to be really realistic about that, which brings me to my next one. Be realistic, which also means credible. Can you accomplish it in the timeline that you are trying to put out? Is this an advocacy initiative that folks, will be on board with? These are just things that you have to start thinking about. And then lastly, time. How much time will you allot yourself to be able to accomplish this goal? There are some advocacy activities that can take up to 3 to 5 years. There are some that are a lot quicker than that, some that can take place over the next few months. It's just about establishing what those objectives or what those goals look like. And so my advocacy goal was to have Reading Awareness Month recognized by the Cincinnati City Council and to collect books for underserved children, as well as providing literacy resources for underserved families. And so in January of 2020, I knew that I had a short amount of time to accomplish this project because March is actually National Reading Awareness Month. And so I was like, I only have a few months to do this. Is this realistic for me to be able to accomplish? And so the next thing I did was identify key stakeholders that have an interest or a disinterest in my mission of Reading Awareness Month. And with the stakeholder analysis, you start to identify interests, whether or not they're positive or negative. You assess the importance, influence, and the impact that your initiative will have on people that are key stakeholders within your project. What does each stakeholder need within your project? Do they want to see the project succeed or fail? Do they want to use the project to meet their own objectives, and et cetera? It's essential to start considering these questions when planning the project, rather than simply assuming that everyone wants the same thing, because we're all on different pages. We all have different perspectives on these key science policy issues. And so you have to assess, how do they feel about it? And that starts with having conversation. That starts with researching. That starts with creating partnerships and figuring out who are the key individuals that your initiative would affect. And so, you identify your key stakeholders, you assess the influence or the importance and the level of impact upon each stakeholder, and then you identify how to engage them. And so key stakeholders within my project were, of course, parents, children, teachers, the public school systems, literacy organizations. And I had to really start to assess, how would this initiative be beneficial? Who would be satisfied? Who wouldn't be satisfied with what we were trying to pursue? And luckily, there wasn't a lot of dissatisfaction with pursuing, Reading Awareness Month within Cincinnati. So I didn't run into that issue as much, but it can happen. The next thing you want to do is start to cultivate strategic partnerships. You want to determine and consider your goals and if they align with community organizations that are already out there. There are so many organizations that are doing incredible work, boots on the ground, grassroots advocacy on a day-to-day basis. And so sometimes you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel if somebody is already creating this flow of information, or is already really started on the path for accomplishing whatever advocacy initiative that you are doing. You could join in on that fight with them. And so I started to identify certain partnerships that I could potentially take. And one of the first organizations that I had a discussion with was the Blue Manatee Literacy Project. This organization has donated over 50,000 books to underserved children within the greater Cincinnati area. They do a lot of work within the community, and I knew that they would be a great partner. In addition, the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is where I was doing my dissertation research, is highly focused on improving the overall well-being of children and their families. They were another key partnership that I really wanted to establish. The public libraries, oh, I love the library. The library is the go-to place to go. Lots of families underserved families especially, are accessing libraries for the services that they have. And so it would be a great way I knew that it would be a great way to rely on them and to pull them in. Read Aloud, it's another really incredible nonprofit organization that encourages families to read to their children at least 15 minutes a day. And then, of course, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, which I am a member. And this organization, or nonprofit status, is also focused on cultivating positive experiences for underserved families. One of our programmatic thrust is in educational development. And so we have a lot of programming that's coming out of that to support girls and adolescents, to really start to inspire them to pursue educational opportunities. So I also knew that I had to establish transparent communication. So in the conversations that I was having with these different groups to kind of pull them in as partners, I was telling them what my goals and my objectives were, how I wanted them to be able to participate in the mission of accomplishing Reading Awareness Month at a local level. And so we really started to create a strategic plan together on how we could work together concisely. And that comes down to coordinating. Coordination is key. You want everybody to have their roles very clearly aligned and understood so that there's no confusion as you're trying to move forward, especially with projects that may be very, very big. Delegation is critical. And so you're not able to accomplish everything by yourself sometimes. So if you pull in those key strategic partnerships, those people can fill in some of the gaps or some of your slack, if there is any. And then lastly, you can learn so much from these organizations and these partnerships that you're establishing. You have this one perspective, maybe from the scientific side, where you're pulling that in to accomplishing your advocacy goal, but they may have a community perspective and may understand the community in a way that you don't, because they work with them boots on the ground. And so it's important that we are willing to learn and coordinate and work together so that we can accomplish a goal. The next thing is researching your legislators. Start identifying those people that you want to reach out to accomplish your advocacy goal. So next, I identified a point of contact for my advocacy goals. So I started researching or combing through the Cincinnati City Council website to find a legislator that would be on board with promoting literacy experiences for underserved children. And that's where I found Council Member Greg Landsman. He is a former public school teacher. He is a staunch advocate for Southwest Ohio families. He spent his career fighting for working families and successfully led the Preschool Promise program, which now provides quality preschool for Cincinnati's 3- and 4-year-old children. He also has proven to have a strong voice since his election in 2017 for children and families across the region on issues such as housing, jobs, environmental issues, and public safety. So I knew he was the person that I really wanted to contact and talk to out of all of the council members actually that I saw on the website, because his background more so aligned with what I was trying to do. So set out cold emails, cold calls. I called and I called and I called, and you have to be persistent when it comes to some of your council members or whoever you're reaching out to, because they are busy people. Sometimes they're working through their staffers and are trying to coordinate lots of different activities. So the persistence is definitely key in this area. but persistence paid off, and he finally got back to me. And, after discussions with his staffer about the goal of this initiative, we decided that a resolution would be the best way to have Reading Awareness Month established locally. A resolution actually is a formal expression of opinion, will, or intent from an official body that often addresses a matter of special or temporary nature. And this particular issue was supposed to raise awareness to the fact that underserved populations were underperforming on reading achievement, raise awareness for why we needed to place more literacy resources, more programs in these communities to really support folks in their advocacy, their literacy journey. So the next thing after my discussion with Councilmember Rick Landsman was to create an engagement plan. Okay, so what activities were we gonna do for Reading Awareness Month locally? And the first thing that I knew that I wanted to do was to distribute resources to the community about environmental contributions to reading and brain development. And why this was important is because there's so much jargon in science. It is sometimes so hard for a layperson to dig through scientific articles to get the key or bigger picture of what the research is trying to say. And so creating simplified versions, whether through infographics or webinars or one-on-one conversations with community members to really cut out that middleman or that jargon so that all folks are knowledgeable about what the science is saying. So that was one of the first things that I wanted to do for my engagement plan. The next thing I wanted to do was to provide literacy resources to promote a healthy home literacy environment by providing books to low-income students. This was really important for me, again, because these children oftentimes don't have a lot of books at home. And sometimes that just starts with access and resources and money. And maybe folks can afford to have those resources in their homes. And so we really wanted to figure out a way to place those resources in the home of underserved students so that they would have their own at-home libraries to at least start that process. And then the last thing, as we discussed before, was to write a resolution for Cincinnati Reading Awareness Month to have that established. And so working with Councilmember Greg Landsman and his staffer to really start to get that off of the ground. So for this engagement plan, you really want to identify what your policy influence objective is. Like we talked about, stakeholder focused outcomes, be realistic. You wanted to develop a theory of how to facilitate the change, a communication strategy. So for my communication strategy, creating those literacy resources to distribute to the community. And then writing up the engagement plan. I have so many notes from when I was establishing this project, just to keep myself on track and also to keep all of the folks that I was pulling in on track for just what our engagement strategy was. So the first thing was communicating the importance of a healthy home literacy environment. And so the person that you see right here is Dr. John Hutton. He is a spokesperson, a reading spokesperson for Read Aloud, which is a organization that focuses on bringing together partners nationwide to really emphasize the importance of reading 15 minutes daily of reading aloud with children and families. And they especially provide resources for underserved families. And Dr. Hutton had a unique perspective about this because not only was he their spokesperson, but he was also one of my mentors at the University of Cincinnati. And he was a great mentor to me and really helped facilitate a lot of the things that I was doing within the program, within trying to accomplish this advocacy goal. And he actually connected me with the Read Aloud folks so that we could create these infographics that could be shared to children and their families. And it was so much fun putting these together and trying to figure out the right language to include. We had a child graphic that was distributed to children, and then a parent graphic, which was a little bit more technical. It included some of those brain findings. And so we really took time to break down the information, make it visually appealing for the folks that were going to be getting these infographics, and that it was clear, just clear information that could be used in a successful way. Oops. So from there, trying to collect those books, I created the Cincinnati Reading and Literacy Fair. And we specifically, on a smaller scale, targeted a school that was 100% free or reduced lunch. All the children at that school were of color, or majority were of color. And I started working with some of the teachers there to start to identify like what some of the needs were for the different age groups, how many books that we needed to collect for those different age groups, and how to really start to get donations for that. So I put out tons of blasts on social media about what I was trying to do, sent it to family members, friends. I reached out to organizations that also donate books for a living to children. And so through all of those different avenues that I took, I was able to collect over 1,000 books for children at this school, which was enough for each student to at least take home 2 books to their home. And so it was super powerful and amazing every time I would go to the mail and be a new book that somebody had just sent over. It was super just amazing to see how communities can come together and how people were all emboldened to really want to support the students at this school. But of course, you know, this fair was supposed to be for March 20th, and boom, COVID-19 hit. So we really had to start to think creatively about how we were going to carry out this initiative. So it took a little bit of time to then get the books over to those students because everything was at a halt. Children were not in school at that time since they were all working remotely. And so I had to coordinate with some of those teachers on how we were able to get those books to the students in a safe manner. But also getting the resolution passed happened a little bit later because Cincinnati City Council also shut down temporarily. So September 2nd, 2020, Greg Landsman reached out to me and he was like, hey, we're finally back in session. Your resolution is on the docket, like tune in to, you know, our online site and, you know, definitely tune in and watch, because at that time they were also restricting who was able to be present for those city council sessions due to COVID. But this was just such a beautiful moment to watch and see them pass this resolution and just to talk about the importance of really serving the kids that were falling behind in regards to literacy experiences. So some of the lessons learned from this: partnerships are essential for sustainable change. You cannot do it by yourself. We can get there together. And a lot of these organizations have the same mission as us. We just have to figure out how to work together. Effective science communication can transcend all age groups. And so, for example, those graphics that we put together, making sure that we were breaking down the scientific information for a child audience, while also simultaneously giving that information to parents and making that information clear. And then being flexible and open to changes and plans. I was devastated when everything got shut down in March because we had this reading fair planned. We had like a mascot coming in. It was going to be like one of those reading fairs that, you know, we would have in elementary school where you would go to the book fair and you pick out the books. It was going to be a really incredible experience with tons of volunteers, but, you know, we had to be flexible and change our plans in order to make sure we were able to do things safely. And eventually the kids did get those books and they were thrilled to have those books for their homes. And lastly, your voice matters. You have something to say. You guys are all in some type of capacity working on your science degrees. You have background knowledge to be able to carry out things effectively. So remember to rely on your voice. So I continue to want to get more experiences in science policy and advocacy. So I then began a program with NSPN, again, great resource, the National Science Policy Network SciPol Scholars Program, which provided a 5-week of intensive training in science policy and advocacy, and then a potential placement opportunity to intern with a science policy organization. So I got lucky and I was placed with Science for Georgia up here. Science for Georgia is a nonprofit organization, that aims to build a bridge between scientists and the public and advocate for the responsible use of science and public policy. And I worked with Dr. Amy Sharma, who was a previous AAAS fellow, and just really an incredible mentor overall. I had so much fun collaborating with her and talking about my interests, and she's still a mentor to me today. So we just talked about what could we do within the community. And, literacy was one of those big things for me. And I told her about, what we were able to accomplish in Cincinnati. She was just like, okay, let's do this in Georgia. We can do this at a state level. So we started to create that engagement plan of how we were going to start getting Reading Awareness Month recognized in Georgia for the state of Georgia. So we wanted to create a directory of literacy resources for underserved families. Folks were still kind of doing like that hybrid model, or they were kind of in school, but kind of not in school, and things were getting shut down all the time. And one of the things that I learned, especially when doing an assessment of public libraries and like accessibility to underserved families, was that a lot of folks were really relying on the libraries during the shutdown to access internet and to access literacy resources and to access all of these different things to help them out. So we wanted to make things more accessible and easy since there were so many organizations putting out information. So we created this reading resource directory so that families could easily access links and programs that would help promote the home literacy environment for their own children. The next thing we did was also establish infographics about reading awareness in Georgia, and then the impact of poverty on reading and how we can start to combat that with programming. So the infographics also contain recommendations for assessing budget, assessing programs, things along those lines that we were able to distribute and give to public libraries, but also community members. And then lastly, we wanted to collect books to distribute to Reach Out and Read hospitals. So this Reach Out and Read program, actually within the first couple of years of a child's age, they are able to have these well visits with physicians who inspire or tell parents like, hey, it's important, to be reading to your child on a day-to-day basis, and this is the ways that you can do that. And at those well visits, they then provide books and resources to those families to take home with them. And so we created this partnership with Reach Out and Read in order to donate the books that we were collecting. Specifically, a lot of our book donations came from Black-owned bookstores, which was really dope, that from that DEI perspective. Really making sure that we were including culturally competent books, especially for the populations we were trying to serve. And so this became a great resource for us. And then lastly, I had to have a lot of conversations with the Georgia General Assembly about what our mission was. And I didn't just talk to Democrats. We had to make sure this was nonpartisan. I also spoke to Republican representatives. So we had Becky Evans, we had Matt Dubnick, and really started to work with those two folks in order to lead this initiative and get Georgia to recognize Reading Awareness Month, and then to create like more sustainable change around literacy within the community. And so this resolution was passed. We actually had 2 resolutions passed about this topic. And you can see here in this picture, the folks from Science for Georgia, but also Matt Dubnick and Becky Evans. And there's my picture right there because I lived in Cincinnati at the time, so I could not come to Georgia, but this was a really powerful movement. And what has come out of that is the establishment of a literacy committee in which Georgia organizations, elected officials, Science for Georgia, are all working together to discuss literacy issues in Georgia, which is still ongoing right now. And so I'm super excited to see what the outcome will be from this program and from the initiatives that we were able to establish. So currently, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia University. I am in the Environment, Brain, and Behavior Lab with Dr. Amy Margolis, where we focus on the influences of chemical and social exposures on brain development, but also different aspects of child behavior, such as ADHD or psychiatric disorders or learning outcomes, self-regulation. And I pursued this postdoc actually through Science for Georgia, where I attended one of their events, and I was listening to this one speaker talk about the research that they were doing on air pollution and bisphenols, on child development, some of the infographics that they were creating to distribute to do community outreach. And I was like, I like this. This is really cool. Let me shoot my shot on LinkedIn and reach out to this lady and see, what opportunities may be available once I graduate. So I connected with her. Her name was Dr. Julie Herbstman, and she did more molecular, cellular, wet lab work as opposed to human research studies. So she was like, I know the perfect person to connect you with. Let me connect you to Amy. And I remember over Thanksgiving, I think in 2021-ish, I interviewed with her, and we decided that I was going to pursue postdoc research fellowship with her. And I was extremely excited about this because their work was primarily focused on Black and Latinx populations, folks that are underserved and are often excluded from research. And they've really made a concerted effort to try to retain these participants and work with them and have cultural competency. So I knew this was the perfect place for me. So Black and Latinx populations are overwhelmingly present in communities with environmental, chemical, and social hazards. And these hazards have been associated with lower academic achievement, poor self-regulation, and alterations in brain development in childhood. And so it became really critical for me able to study these factors and see how they associated to child development. And so within their research, they have participants that are within this prospective longitudinal birth cohort. All mothers are enrolled within their third trimester of pregnancy, and all participants within their study identify as Black and or Latinx and reside in the New York City area. So there is a lot of pollution in New York City. There's so much, it's really bad here. Even with all of the regulations that they've put out, even small levels of exposures can be very detrimental to the developing brain for young children. And so within my own research at Columbia, I've been able to assess the interactive effects of environmental air pollution, especially that exposure prenatally, and childhood material hardship, which is the unmet basic needs for kids, such as housing, healthcare, food insecurities, clothing, etc., and how those affect reading skills. And within my own research, what we found was that the higher the prenatal air pollution exposure and the higher the childhood material hardship, the lower the word reading was for their children by the time they were 7 years old. And 7 is that critical age period where you're taking the skills that you know about reading acquisition, and then you're translating that to a comprehension aspect. So you're going from learning to read to reading to learn. And that has to be sustainable in some aspect. And so if word reading is affected, reading comprehension could later be affected. And then kids may have more of a susceptibility for having to be in special education services, needing academic support services. And these kids are going to continue to fall behind if we don't figure out ways to successfully support them and try to assess some of those chemical and social exposures that influence reading. So the next thing I really wanted to do was be a part of the Early Career Policy Ambassadors Program. And this is with the Society for Neuroscience, SFN. And this program is designed to create a network of neuroscience advocates, ambassadors to gain skills on how to advocate for science and to encourage others to join in that conversation. And so the program activities consisted of a Hill Day. It consisted of us also conducting our own advocacy projects, as well as a presentation on our advocacy initiatives at the Society for Neuroscience Conference. So one of the advocacy projects that I really wanted to pursue to draw attention to environmental health disparities and specifically how they affect child self-regulation and learning outcomes was a multi-lab tour at Columbia to engage legislators in these topics, but to also inspire them or implore them to support scientific research funding as the budget was currently up. So the objectives of that tour were to host New York City legislators at Columbia University to highlight neuroscience and environmental health disparities research. I knew that I wanted to advocate for increased support of federal research funding so that we can continue doing this research and on developmental neurotoxicants and child brain outcomes, and to really establish this collaborative effort to increase the environmental health policy in New York City. So in order to plan this advocacy tour, I knew I really wanted to pull in or really contact the right people. And there's a lot of bureaucracy when it comes to trying to plan things like this. There are a lot of people that need to be contacted. So if you're within your own community and you want to do something like this, make sure that you're reaching out to the right people, because I knew this was really tricky for me with knowing who could help me accomplish this mission. So I first established communications with our Office of Government and Community Affairs. I had in-depth discussions with them about what the objectives and the goals for the tour was, when we wanted it to be scheduled, how they could help. And this was really a great starting point for me to really get this initiative off the ground. We all have government and community affairs offices, or should have them. And so if you're thinking about doing something like this in your own community, definitely establish that bridge in communication with them. I then contacted department and division leadership at Columbia, because I needed guidance on how to host a state representative at my university, or at least a representative of that person's office. And so through those conversations, I started to learn some of the ins and outs of what that was going to look like. And then next, I really identified interdisciplinary faculty members across campuses to present 5-minute flash talks about their research. So I pulled in folks from the public health, Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, as well as the climate school, as they all had really diverse perspectives to bring to this conversation. The next thing you want to do, identify your legislators. And SFN has this beautiful tool where you can go in and their advocacy network, type in your location and where you're located, and they'll spit back out to you. Here are your federal elected officials. Want to send them a message, which you can through their website or their advocacy network. But I just wanted to identify who they were so that I could start sending emails and cold emails. So we had Representative Adriano Espaillat, we have Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and then Senator Chuck Schumer, and of course, President Joe Biden, but primarily focused on the New York representatives. And I start sending cold emails and calls. I called these people literally every day and left voicemail messages. And there are different offices. They might have their office located in your state, but then they also have their office in Washington, D.C. So you really want to make sure that you're contacting the right place, because I did mess up at one point in time, and I was contacting Adriano Espaillat's office in Washington, D.C. That message ended up getting to the New York State office after another call that I placed to them. And I was like, hey, I've been sending you all emails about this tour. And one of the women on the phone was like, oh yeah, we saw that email. They sent it over from the Washington, D.C. office. Like, this is something that we're definitely interested in. So again, coming back to that persistence aspect, definitely keep contacting and calling, because they get tons of calls and emails all the time. And sometimes it can be hard to weave through that, but that persistence helps to make you stand apart from that. So going into what that structure of the multi-lab tour looked like, we had Deputy District Director Nina Norwood, who attended it as a representative of Congressman Espaillat's office. And first we had just an overview of what we were going to talk about and our agenda and our asks from the representative. And then we started to go through some of these flash talks. So we first had Dr. Herbstman talk about some of the longitudinal birth cohorts that we do have at our hospital, and how they're important for pregnant people in New York City. The next thing we talked about was the effects of environmental air pollution on child development. This was a presentation by Dr. Amy Margolis. The next talk was on the impact of indoor air pollution on the adolescent brain in Ghana. So incorporating that international perspective and showing that, air pollution is bad anywhere. And then understanding the mechanism of early life stress on the brain in animal models. And that was done by Alex Chernovsky right here. We also provided them with informational resources, such as infographics on indoor air pollution. And these are infographics that are actually present on our Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health website. So it was easy to access those infographics from there. And then also the New York Federal Research Funding statistics for SFN, because we didn't just want to ask them to support our science policy objectives with environmental health disparities, but we also wanted them to support the push for more scientific research funding to really help us to keep doing the work we're doing, because all of our studies are funded by the NIH. In order to do the work, you need the money. And so we really tried to drive that home during the presentation. So the outcomes were, we were really able to inform the SYOT office that research at the CCCAH is designed to inform public policy and create the sustainable future for our communities. We encourage collaborative efforts between our office or our school and the office from the Adriana Espaillat's office to address environmental health disparities in New York City. And one of the beautiful things that came out of that was they want us to continue to collaborate with them, send them research articles about our publications and things that we're discovering. And they encourage us to do this at a much larger scale so that we could include city council members, advocacy groups within New York City that are also passionate about doing this work. And then lastly, the information about the tour was published on our community health website. And we had a lot of conversations on Twitter, which was really beautiful. So lessons and future directions. We incorporated a guided tour at Columbia and incorporated all of these different components in order to accomplish our goal. We really want to increase the scale of the multi-lab tour. So that's a lesson that was definitely learned. Including city council members is important. Establishing more community partnerships by including local organizations in the future, because they are also critical key stakeholders, and to keep the Espaillat office abreast of the research that we're doing for the future. So those are just some of the activities that I have done so far, and I'm always looking for new ways to go into the community and to do community outreach in some capacity. So I definitely think these experiences have helped to propel me forward and have really start to shape how I see my career going. So with that, I'll take any questions from the group and I'll stop sharing.
Awesome, Dr. Greenwood. There are some questions that were left ahead of time, so let me pull those up from the chat. Also, just share my screen, give us a little background. Let's see. Okay, first question. If you feel like you do not have enough experience in policy writing, what are some resources to help you get started?
Ooh, that is a great question. So that's a really good question. So I cannot remember the organization's name off the top of my head. I'm going to dig through my email and send it to you all, but there are tons of organizations that are hosting policy memorandum workshops. I actually attended one maybe a couple of months ago that was super helpful with me to start thinking about how I wanted to structure my ideas, how I wanted to actually learn how to write those policy memorandums, put out recommendations. So NSPN is also a great resource. They have a lot of collaborations with organizations that are doing this work. So I'll dig through my email, try to find that organization's name, and I'll send that out to the group. But there are tons of people hosting workshops on a day-to-day basis about these things and how to write. So I think that's always a great way to get started. Attend the workshops, attend those training sessions. Those are always helpful.
Okay, so there's another question in the chat, but kind of springboarding off of that. Yeah. When you were making like the cold calls and the emails and just, being really persistent in terms of, I guess, like scripted like emails or like a script to say on the phone, what would be your recommendation or suggestion about how best to go about creating that?
Yeah, you want to remember that people's attention spans are really short. And so with emails, you don't want to overload them with a ton of information. You want to get to the straight points of what your ask is. Here's the background information, maybe a one sentence about what the topic is, what your one sentence on what you're planning to do, and how you see that office being engaged in that work if you're seeing an email. And then ask for a follow-up where you can have a conversation over the phone and go into more detail about the topic that at hand. I got lucky in some capacity because I called so much that they ended up answering. And So I had a script already prepared about the background information that I wanted to tell them. I told them about my advocacy objectives and why this was important to incorporate the science in that capacity, and then how I saw them filling in that role. And also
Mm,
you know, hype in their heads a little bit. Like, I've seen all of the cool work you've done on X, Y, and Z. I've read your website, blah, blah, blah. I think you'd be a great partner for this initiative. So, I would love to move forward with you. So that was always something that was super helpful for me, incorporating the background, laying out the objectives clearly, and allowing them to really ask you questions and go into more depth. You don't want to throw a whole bunch of information at them all at once, because it's really hard to disentangle and really get out what the key goal is when you're throwing so much information. And I learned that early on with my dissertation, especially with my research mentor, because I would send her these emails and she would only read the first sentence. So I'm like, this isn't helpful. This isn't going to work. So I need to think about how I'm structuring my emails and how I'm laying out this information so that it's clear. So that's something that I really tried to keep at the forefront of my mind: clear, concise, and put it out there.
Thank you for that. Back to the chat. What would be your advice for juggling all of this with coursework? So this was back around about 30 minutes into your presentation.
Yeah. So I keep a planner with me wherever I go, and notes. I have to keep myself organized for my ADHD brain. And so in order to keep all of those things together, I would write out for each day what I wanted to accomplish. And I wouldn't list out every single thing, because you're not able to get everything done in one day. But, dedicating your time to your dissertation research, what tasks need to be accomplished for my dissertation research, so that I can also start to bring in some of the other things that I'm passionate about, which is community engagement, community outreach, having conversations with key stakeholders. And I had to make it a mission of mine to also talk to potential mentors that were within my laboratory, or who worked in the same lab as me, so that, I could kill two birds with one stone. I could talk about my research while also being like, hey, how do we get this research out to the community? How do we disseminate it? And so I had to just be strategic about coordinating and being realistic about what time I did have. And if I needed to, do this other activity after 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, when I'm leaving lab, I'm going to do it, because I'm that passionate about it and I want it to be accomplished. And so again, coming back to, you don't have to do this all by yourself. Pulling in key partnerships or folks that also are aligned with your mission can help to take some of that stuff off your plate. So it doesn't all just fall on you. Create those partnerships so that you are able to successfully do your dissertation work while also accomplishing whatever your advocacy goal is.
Thank you for that. And as a former English major, I just want to say that, like, your focus on reading and learning to read, reading to learn, that just spoke to me immediately. But I did want to ask in terms of, and if I missed it, I apologize, but with all the persistence and reaching out to people, initiating those points of contacts, were there ever any moments where, and I hope not, but that you possibly received rejection that maybe you had to, like, redirect your steps?
Yes. So I can actually speak from, oh, thank you, Daniel. Have a great day. Um, so I can actually speak to the Advocate multi-lab tour that I was planning. And I'm sorry if you guys can hear all that drilling in the background, they're doing it again. So while trying to get that off of the ground, there were key people that I was trying to remember to contact and to remember to establish connections with, that, I was a new postdoc. I really didn't know everybody. And I remember running into some issues with some of the higher up folks who were like, why weren't we abreast of this? Why weren't we doing this? And blah, 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 blah. And, the tour almost came to a halt off of the strength of that alone. And I was extremely devastated, but I worked with my mentor in order to kind of overcome that, really change the language and tell them why this was super important for us to get off the ground. But also on the side of trying to get legislators to come to our campus, I didn't just have a state representative coming. I had city council members who had agreed to actually attend this tour. And the day of, they contacted me and let me know that they were no longer able to attend. And so I was freaking out. I was like, we have all these things coordinated, we have all these plans, and I don't even know if I'm going to get one person here. But everything works out exactly how it's supposed to. And, those city council members I still have connections with and contacts with, and they do want to, in the future, reach out and, actually attend events in the future. But I had to be really flexible about how I was approaching the situation. And we were able to have at least one person, and one person is better than no people. So trying to be flexible is difficult. It's very difficult for me. I don't like change very much, but I try my best. But I had to be adaptable because, this is the type of stuff that happens. People change their minds or they get busy, and you have to just roll with the punches, roll with the flow.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that is a reality and your specific scenario that many people need to hear, especially as people put a lot into events and meetings and whatnot, and having to just kind of readjust with that element of flexibility, but also putting yourself out there with that persistence that you were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
So does anyone else in the chat have any questions?
Any question is a good question. And if not, you can definitely send me an email. I know you guys have access to my slides. I did change them a little bit, so I'll send you the updated slide deck. But I did have like a mini activity just we don't have to do it now, but just to kind of get folks thinking about how they can start to apply some of this information in their own context. So I can share my screen really briefly just to kind of lay out the questions. So you guys can know how to get some of this work off. Oops, that is not it. This is how I share. Okay. Oops. So we went over a couple of points, but I just want to kind of put some questions out there for you all about, how to start thinking about this, start identifying, what are your advocacy goals? Another summary we talked about who are the key stakeholders that you would include in your analyses? Who would you partner with to accomplish this goal? Who are your legislators? And what is your engagement plan overall? And so I don't know if we don't have to do this right now, but I wanted to kind of put that out there that this is an outline that you all can potentially use to think about structuring some of those things. And I'll send this out later so you guys have access to it.
Now, this is really helpful.
Thank you.
And it also just kind of gets you in the headspace of thinking about that, like who are my legislators, and kind of what are they working on, and how does that affect me?
What are their priorities? Like, read those websites, you guys. Read the websites. When I was doing the work with Science for Georgia, and we were having to, and oh Lord, some very interesting characters. I will not point to any specific political party, but I had to be really strategic about my messaging with some of those folks, because how they would approach supporting literacy is much different than how another group would support literacy. So read those websites. Read them.
Yes, that's perfect. Well, if there aren't any more questions in real time, remember that you can put them in the chat, or send them along later. We'll get those answered. But Dr. Greenwood, we just want to thank you for your time and sharing your journey and all the different programs that you have been a part of and the work that you have done. Very transformative. And I personally can't wait to see what you do next. So I will be keeping an eye out for that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. I love the HBCU college tour so much. I think this is such an incredible opportunity that I wish I would have had when I was a doctoral candidate, to know what opportunities were available, to hear from speakers like this who are talking about their journeys and ways to get involved. So, I wish you all many blessings on this call. I hope everything continues to work out in a positive way. And that if you do have any questions, I did place my my personal email in the chat. Please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any of those things. And I wish you all the best.